It's Rick Jones of FishBait Solutions, welcoming you all back to From the Bridge. I'm just back from 2 weeks across the pond in the UK and had a chance to see my family, but I'm glad to be back. But I came back and it's a little chilly this morning. I think fall has finally arrived, and that's probably a good thing. I like cooler weather and real football weather as we get down the final stretch of the season. As promised, this week we're going to take a deep look at NIL, name, image, and likeness, and what it means or might mean to college athletics. My guest is Wesley Haynes, who is the CEO of the Brandar Group and a partner with Campus Lore. No one, and I mean no one, understands the opportunities posed by NIL better than Wesley. We're going to take another trip up on the Soapbox and find yet another fun place to eat on the road with Rick. NIL is a very deep subject, so let's head to deep water today from the bridge. In 1987, SMU, that's Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, a perennial college football powerhouse, got the death penalty, and their program was suspended largely for what is now legal with the new name, image, and likeness legislation from states across the country. If you remember that period, they had two great running backs, Eric Dickerson and Craig James, and they were accused of paying players, which of course they were doing. But now with the new NIL, you actually can play players. So how far have we come? In fact, SMU, the bag man, the guy actually paying the players at SMU was the governor of Texas, Governor Hodges. He was the one that was writing checks or handing them cash. Today, we have multiple states that have passed laws giving student athletes the rights to monetize their images and monetize their social posts and other things that they personally do. Here's the problem. We have all these state laws, but no national law. Now, what we do know is this. Congress is trying to figure it out, and it is really a bipartisan thing because neither political party wants to say they killed college athletics. And so they're working together. But in our recent election, when the Democrats regained control of the Senate, or at least the equality of the Senate, all of the committee chairs switched, and that slows down legislation. Had the Republicans kept the Senate, I think a bill would have been passed already that would have a national meaning that would trump all these individual state laws. Right now, it's crazy out there. It's the Wild Wild West, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. Now, we know this. The NCAA wants restrictions. Of course they do. They don't want players appearing in their team or school gear. They're against collective rights, so that means no trading cards or no video games or no other ways that athletes can create value collectively. I mentioned last week that Scout Sports and Entertainment had done a study of fans and what they thought of NIL, and that most people under 40 seem to agree that college athletes should have these rights. And most people over 40 say, nah, not so much. I want to start today's discussion with what I call the myth of money, though. There is this myth out there that colleges and universities are taking in hundreds of millions of dollars and are keeping it. And that is a myth. Yes, coaches make a lot of money, and you see with the recent dismissal of a guy who won a national championship 2 years ago, Ed Orgeron at LSU, that they're high stakes and that coaches do make a lot of money and in many cases make a lot of money in severance to go away. But the vast majority of the money that is made in college football and college basketball goes back to scholarships for other student athletes in sports that don't create a profit. Football funds women's soccer and men's volleyball and track and field and baseball and softball and fencing and skiing and all of the other sports. And so there's this myth that we're exploiting players and that they should be getting their share of this big piece of money. It's simply not true. Now, because Wesley today is going to take the position that athletes should have both individual and collective rights, I'm going to play the contrarian and tell you why I think this is fraught with problems. And please remember that I tend to be a libertarian at heart. I'm a guy that believes in the free market. But I do want to kind of play the devil's advocate to what I think Wesley's going to talk to us about. So here are my 4 top reasons why I am concerned about NIL. Problem number 1. There are these things out there called Pell Grants. Pell Grants are government-backed scholarships. If you fall below a certain income level as a family or as an individual, you qualify for Pell Grants. I can't tell you how many minority athletes are on Pell Grants. These are grants that the government is actually subsidizing college athletics. Well, if you make more than $15,000 a year as a student athlete, you lose your Pell Grant. You could lose your scholarship, which means the ecosystem is going to have to come up with that money. And let's think, what if you were an out-of-state student? Now the athletic department has got to pay out-of-state tuition, full amounts of out-of-state tuition, and that's going to continue to mess up the financial system. Problem number 2, NIL comes at the same time as we have this thing called the transfer portal. That means I can up and leave anytime I want and go anywhere I want to play for anybody I want to. Now, that's great, but what's going to prevent a car dealership from coming to me and saying, hey, if you transfer over here and play quarterback for us, I'm just going to let you endorse my car dealership for hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. The transfer portal married with NIL is going to create all sorts of unintended consequences. Here's problem number 3. Over the years when my wife and I would travel, and we travel a lot to lots of games, lots of tournaments, and we often stay in hotels where teams are staying, primarily in college basketball. And my wife likes to remind me every time she sees a team meal that there's a whole lot of stupid in that room. No disrespect to college students, but a lot of them are kind of stupid. That's why you go to college. You go to college to become less stupid, right? We all did that. And we all can look back and think about the stupid things we did in college that, thank God, there were no such things as smartphones because we didn't document those. I can deny everything to my kids and grandkids that I ever did because there's no proof. Well, guess what? There's proof everywhere today. If you make a tweet, if you make a post, it will live with you forever. We are seeing adults losing their jobs in business, in sport, and in politics from things they wrote on email over a decade ago. I want to warn student athletes, there will be nowhere to hide forever. Whatever you think and whatever you say and whatever you support and whatever you don't support is going to come back to live with you forever. And I think that's dangerous for young people. And finally, the last reason I'm concerned about NIL is the locker room. You know, in professional sports, some people make more than others, but everybody makes something. Not necessarily in college sports. So I got a hotshot running back who's getting all this money from endorsements or from social posts. What happens when his line says, you know what, hotshot, we ain't blocking for you this week? What happens when wide receivers start dropping balls because quarterbacks are getting paid so much money? Human nature, you can't change it. And I worry about the locker room. What's going to happen when someone's making a lot of money and not performing on the field? What happens when you're in a Dr. Pepper commercial, but you're having a bad season? How do other people react to that? I worry about the locker room. NIL is here to stay, but as we often say, be careful what you wish for. My special guest today is Wesley Haynes, who has spent much of his life in licensing and the use of intellectual property. His current agency, Brand R, is on the frontier of creating value for both current and former student athletes. Let's welcome my pal Wesley to the bridge. Everybody wants me to be. Hey Wesley, it's great to have you today from the bridge.
It's great to be here, Rick. Good to chat with you again. Looking forward to our discussion today.
Well, we're talking about NIL today, and boy, oh boy, is it interesting. And you've been on the cutting edge of this all along. But I always tell all of my guests, I always like to go back to the beginning because it gives us context about kind of where you've come from and where you're going. So talk a little bit about where you grew up, where you went to school, first job, some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, and actually the first job for me does have a lot of relevance here. So I grew up in Alexander City, Alabama, and went to Benjamin Russell High School.
Home of Russell Athletic at the time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was my first job, was with Russell Athletic, after a little stint at Davidson College and then Georgia Tech. And Scott Howell, who was a longtime executive at Russell, and he followed Georgia Tech and knew of my background and offered me a job. And I came back to Russell Athletics, started out, and really spent 2 years doing everything from opening bales of cotton to working in the yarn to screen printing and knitting and sewing. And then finally got over and did some project engineering work and worked my way over into the sales and marketing areas there at Russell Athletic.
I think people today have kind of forgotten about Russell. In that era, they were such a monster. I mean, I think every Major League Baseball uniform was a Russell. They bought more cotton than anybody in the world. Just fascinating. But you were able to really able to learn the business from the ground floor up, which I think too few people do today.
That's exactly right. And one of the first projects I worked on was the Russell Athletic Major League Baseball project. But even before that, even screen printing name and numbers on the backs of jerseys, when Russell Athletic had, I think at one time they had 23 of the 25 top 5 schools or top 25 schools in the AP rankings, and so it was just amazing to see that all of the rights that they had and how it worked. And even going back to the day that Nike reached out to Russell and said, hey, we're going to get into this college apparel business and we want to work on the sidelines and with schools. And so we had some really in-depth conversations with Nike. So it tells you how far back I go.
Well, I'll tell you how far I go back. One of my prized possessions that hangs in my closet is I have a Russell Athletic Atlanta Crackers uniform.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
It really
number one, it's amazing that we actually had a minor league baseball team called the Crackers. That's one amazing thing, but it is a Russell product from way back, before the Braves came to Atlanta, because I grew up in Atlanta and I was a Crackers fan, and went to the old Postolian ballpark and all that. And then obviously I worked at Georgia Tech. I worked for Homer Rice, and Russell was an integral part of Georgia Tech athletics forever. And so I have a great relationship with them. Well, then then your pivot? So you're at Russell, then what came next?
Well, one day the PGA Tour called and said, "Hey, we're thinking about hiring some new folks in licensing and really get our licensing program kicked off." And they had already had signed some agreements with Parodies and some other companies, and so they wanted to kind of take their licensing to the next level. And so they called me and said, "Hey, could you recommend somebody for a job?" And thought about it overnight and recommended myself and moved to Ponte Vedra Beach and worked for the PGA Tour for several years. And you've never left
Ponte Vedra?
No, I haven't left Ponte Vedra. I mean, look, if you've been to Ponte Vedra, it's a pretty good place to hang out. And And so even after I left the PGA Tour, I represented the PGA Tour's licensing efforts for another 10 to 12 years with IMG. And that's kind of how I got reconnected back from my Russell days with Bill and Pat Battle, that we both know and respect a lot. And um, Bill and Pat had done some work for the PGA Tour and had developed a little company called Licensing Partners International that did some work with Canadian Football League and NASCAR and then with the
Churchill
PGA
Downs too, I
Tour.
think, at one time, didn't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Churchill
Yep.
Downs, exactly. And so I left the tour, formed a little partnership with W.C. Bradley Company, who's in Columbus, Georgia,
Yep.
and great family that I've known and the Battles. And so we kicked off LPI, and I went over to run that for several years. So stayed in the licensing area and stayed in the sports area, but just changed roles a bit.
Well, I'm so old. My wife's aunt owned the second house ever built at Sawgrass.
No joke.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
That would be worth something today.
yeah. Well, it's not much of a house compared to what they've built, since then. This was over on the beach side, and when Charlotte and I dated and first got married, we would go and stay with them. And obviously, I did a lot of work with the tour when Nabisco was the umbrella sponsor of the PGA Tour, and we were their agency of record during that Ross Johnson era when we had all the great golfers. So I've spent a lot of time, with the tour, and I know the great job that you did, because really, candidly, they did not have a licensing program. I mean, they were a little bit like when Bill got involved with, first Coach Bryant and then Alabama. They didn't know what they had, but they knew they weren't making any money. And y'all turned that thing upside down and built, those great PGA Tour stores and airports and other places.
Yeah, and that also got us into the video gaming area with EA Sports, and so for me, I had the great opportunity to work with Russell Athletic and be a licensee of college and work with it from the licensee side, the manufacturer side, and then it was kind of neat to be on the brand side and put these deals together and get introduced to a whole new crop of companies like the EA Sports and the Parodies, and then to reacquaint myself and do additional business with Bill and Pat, who I again just really respect, and I know you feel the same way, and we think the world of them. I guess Bill probably created the sports licensing business for all intent and purposes.
No, there's no question that he did. I told Bill the other day we had a really nice dinner the other night in Birmingham at one of Frank Stitt's restaurants, Bottega, and I had Bill on. He's got a new book out called The Master's Plan that is so good. I mean, I've told everybody that if you're interested in sports marketing and licensing, you have to read the book. But it's not only about CLC, but it's about, his journey and the people that influenced him. But I told him this, and I really mean this. I never met anyone at CLC that I didn't like.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It always started with he just hired people that had great integrity and great character. And so there was always a level of trust that, and I also like this, I never felt like CLC wanted to get the last nickel.
That's exactly right.
And I've worked with other people that when you leave, you go, is my wallet still? It's still in my pocket, because I'm not so sure that there's anything left. He understood clearly the IP rights. The schools had to win, but the licensee had to win. I mean, we had to make it where it was going to. If you didn't build a good business, they were going to go away.
Yep.
And then he realized the retailer had to win, and that's kind of rare. People are always looking around for the loser at the table, and I laughingly said, "Oh, there was a loser. It was the NFL. They weren't at the table."
That's right.
I mean, there wasn't anybody at the table and I think that kind of leads us to the discussion that I want to have with you. Part of it today about NIL is everybody has to win in order for the ecosystem to work. And
Absolutely.
and I think your background is paramount to what y'all are doing right now in helping universities, helping student athletes, helping former student athletes in the ecosystem of understanding, that everybody's got to win here, and to do that, you have to build the right kind of architecture. And
Absolutely.
you and I've talked in the past about, for the past 36 months, as we heard rumblings of NIL, and then we had various state legislative bodies pass laws, and then we know that we still can't seem to get a federal overlay law. It's been a little bit like the Wild Wild West. And there have been a lot of people that I think, one of my favorite musicals is The Music Man, and there's a great line, if he doesn't know the territory. And I think there have been some people that have jumped into NIL that I look around and go, they don't know anything about the ecosystem, and that's bad.
Yeah.
And that's bad. So I think your background on that. But when did you first kind of begin to see the tide beginning to shift, and that we were I know this, you were doing with Campus Lore and with some other things, you had seen the value of former student athletes back with their campus marks and with IP. Talk about that. What made you see that then led to now using current student athletes?
Yeah, so to go back on that one, we really need to go back about 8 or 9 years ago now, and so I was involved when I was at IMG, and actually the NFL retained us to help them settle a lawsuit that had been kicked around federal court. It was Fred Dreyer versus NFL Films was the original lawsuit, and it ultimately became a class action suit, and the NFL wanted to get it settled, and there was a lot of complexity on the plaintiff side. There were 2 sets of attorneys involved, and everyone kind of had had mixed agendas, and so ultimately it got settled. And so I went to federal court several different times, and was involved in helping get it settled. But it was through that effort that and the settlement that the federal judge agreed that maybe an agency for retired NFL players could be created to do group rights. And so it was called the Pro Football Retired Players Association. And again, the basic premise of that case was something different, but as an outgrowth of it, there was the creation of this agency. And through that, I met Steve Skeblo and Ahmad Nassar, and who at that time were running the business arm of the NFLPA. And as I'm kind of prone to do, I probably took in a 40-page PowerPoint presentation to explain to them what we were doing for retired players and maybe how we could work with the active NFLPA. And at the end of the meeting, Ahmad and Steve said, Wesley, this is great, but you had 2 slides devoted to college. So I think Jim Brown, not as a Cleveland Browns, but as a Syracuse Orangeman, and Joe Namath, not as a New York Jet, but as an Alabama Crimson Tide player. And they said, Wesley, this is great. Frankly, there are some ways we can work together. But, interesting, you bring up college. And for 10 years, we've been trying to figure out how we could work in college. And if you'd be interested in working with us, maybe we'd be interested in you representing the NFLPA in college. And I thought, wow, this is a fantastic idea. And so that, for me, was the moment in which the light bulb kind of went off, and how I imagined that if we worked with Julio Jones, not as an Atlanta Falcon, but as an Alabama Crimson Tide, and all, Tom Brady, as a Michigan Wolverine, I thought that would be a neat business to get into, and a neat opportunity. But frankly, I thought eventually, because I knew the battles and I knew about the O'Bannon lawsuit, and I knew that lawsuit was making its way through courts, I thought that would be the ultimate catalyst for change. But I believed at some point in the future, and didn't know if it was going to be 1 year or 10 years, that student athletes would probably get their rights back. And if we had this resume that said we did this for the NFLPA, and then later we added the NBPA and Major League Baseball Players Association, they would give us a unique positioning to possibly work for student athletes and do their group rights the same way that the NFLPA does it, which is kind of the gold. They and the NBPA and MLBPA are the gold standard here, and so there were a lot of lessons learned about how they do it and how they manage the program and how group rights work, and so for 8 years we've learned that. And so when this came around, and at the end of June, 1st of July, we were kind of we'd had 8 years to prepare for this. And so while many people thought, well, gosh, you're new to the business, no, we've been doing this for 8 or so years, but doing it for the NFLPA and NBPA and MLBPA.
Well, and I'm a big believer that systems need consistency. And if these are the systems and the processes that the Players Association have, that's where the college student athlete is ultimately going to live in the ecosystem, and they ought to be similar along that. I did find it ironic, and I've been critical of the NCAA on this program, so today's not going to surprise anybody. But in fact, I've said that they've seemed to be on the wrong side of every issue since the Oklahoma-Georgia lawsuit back in the 80s to extend the number of television games that could be on TV. But this idea of, we're going to let student athletes go out and monetize themselves, but they can't use their school IP and they can't do collective rights. I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
I agree.
I mean, it's like really? I mean, that's crazy. And I think state legislators, and I think ultimately the federal government, I do believe that we would have gotten a bill passed had the Democrats not taken control of the Senate. I think it was lined up, and what happens there. No disrespect to the Democrats, but once you have a turnover, all those committee chairs turn, and you go through this education process. But I did think we might have a bill sooner than later, because I don't think either party wants to be the party that messes with college athletics. I think ultimately they'll do the right thing. But I did find it interesting that all of the things that you were doing with the collective rights, with the players' associations, there were some parties in college athletics that said, well, we're not going to do any of that. And that made no sense.
Yeah, and it didn't to me either. And Rick, I think you know this. I like with Bill and Pat Battle, I also had the great pleasure of having another mentor, and this Jim Host and Host Communications. And Jim suggested one day that I go to the NCAA and explain this to them, and he thought that would possibly be something that they should be interested in. And so he talked to the NCAA, and I went there a couple of times, really at their request and on their dime, and they signed me to an NDA on it. And I thought, well, gosh, Jim once again is right, and they're going to get on board on this, and maybe group rights can be the early adopted platform for NIL. And so I went there, and they just basically wanted to learn how it worked, but really had no intention of implementing. In fact, told me as much.
Yeah.
That this was, this was just a non-starter from their perspective, and it was a mistake, frankly. And so, what happened has happened, and at the Supreme Court level, and I think they were wrong. And I also think, frankly, when you think about, professional athletes don't get to choose where they go play. College athletes get to choose their university, and there's just a different relationship between a student athlete and their university and a professional athlete, and who's paying them a salary and it's a job, and so they want to be hero status on product. And you know what? For 50 years, we've told student athletes what you can't do. It's kind of neat now to tell them what you can do and how you can be co-branded with the university. And so that's a part of our stump pitch, if you will, is, why won't you give them a path to be co-branded?
Well, I've said this, Peyton Manning grew old as an NFL quarterback, but he was forever young at Tennessee. And I remember years ago when Jim Host got the rights to NCAA football, he hired me to do the creative for that, and we did we took the song "Forever Young" and did a Steel-O-Matic. And I remember in the video we had, Archie Manning rolling out and then becoming Peyton, and then we had, Bob Greasy rolling out and becoming Brian, and we showed the connectivity, and there's a uniqueness there. And now you add transfer portal to this. I think it's critical to try to. Well, number one, I heard Mac Brown, who we both have a lot of respect for, say the other day, you better be playing too deep. you better be playing too deep all the time, or they're going to be playing against you next year.
That's right.
But the other thing is, I think you can get them more ingrained in being part of the fabric of the institution if you let them exploit, and I use that word as a positive, the collective rights of their individual rights in the school marks. I think at that point you've got them engaged as I'm a Georgia Bulldog, or I'm a Yellow Jacket, or I'm an Oklahoma Sooner. In a time that I think transfer portal kind of changes everything. So I never understood the logic behind not wanting to do it. And again, you and I both know the NCAA football game was a juggernaut of revenues for institutions, and now can be a juggernaut for NIL.
It really can, and I don't see anything that's wrong with that. And to your point, it has become a part of the way student athletes think, and again, they just want to be hero status on product and have mom and dad and their friends and their cousins to buy a jersey with Ohio State on the front and my name and number on the back. And so it's just kind of neat. And I don't see what's wrong with that. And frankly, most universities, once they understand this and understand we're talking about passive use of group rights, they usually come to the conclusion there's just not a downside to doing this today, and I agree with them. There's not a downside to doing it.
Well, Wesley, let me ask you this: has the hesitation been because they think it gets them closer to being unionized? I mean, are they worried that it's really, a workers issue versus a licensing issue or a compensation issue? I mean, is that because I believe you could have collective rights and they're not going to have to be part of a union. I mean, I don't understand that. What do you feel? Why do you feel like people have been negative about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, have we heard that as a reason not to do it? Yes. But the unions and we and you agree, look, you can have a voluntary program. It's messy, yes. Will we get 100% participation? Probably not, but that's okay. And frankly, it's okay that it is messy. But frankly, while we've had that excuse used a couple of times, that's not the prevailing reason. The prevailing reason is that they don't want to be seen as causing compensation. And as you know, most athletic departments are very conservative and most athletic administrators are conservative. And they just want to make sure that they don't do anything wrong. And so as more and more schools adopt this, I think more and more athletic directors and administration folks are getting comfortable that they're not causing compensation. Frankly, we're causing the compensation, and that's why you need a third party to provide that role. We're the one causing the compensation for the student athletes, but they just need to get comfortable in how the mechanics of it works and how this can work. And I actually think, frankly, that it'll be a boom for athletics, college athletics as well. I don't think this is a zero-sum game, as some in the multimedia rights space fear. That, hey, just because the student athletes are making $1, now that's going to pull $1 out of my pocket. I don't agree with that.
Well, I agree with you. I'm a big, I always come as a salesman. I have always been a consultant first. I've always thought about the brand first. The only reason that a brand affiliates with a property, let's say that, Pepsi affiliates with the Florida Gators, is for the fan base. And if there's a way to better engage the fan base using student athletes, that's not a zero sum deal. That's a plus to keep them engaged and involved. And because at the end of the day, you support a brand supports a school in order to meet their business objectives, and that's how do I sell more product? And I think sometimes we forget about that. And this is, in my opinion, just another great club in the golf bag that's going to make you, I think, more effective, and I agree. I think people always feel like the pie is not going to get any bigger, and so I gotta I want to make sure my slice of the pie is going to be this size, and I'm like, no, double the size of the pie. I mean, make the pie bigger. Look at the ecosystem, and how do you take advantage of things along those lines? I think I saw where. And I've been, when you listen to the podcast earlier, I talked about, some of the negatives that I see that we have to be, concerned about. Pell Grants, transfer portal, the fact that, you got to be careful on social media because they live forever. You got to be careful about what you do endorse as a young person. That's why I love a third party like y'all kind of helping them navigate that. But the other thing is, how do you keep the locker room together? I think I saw the Pitt quarterback who's having a hell of a year. He did a deal with a steakhouse, and he takes his offensive lineman there every week.
I know.
I mean,
Really cool.
Isn't that cool? I mean, and we saw
really
that.
Is.
Yeah, we saw that in the NFL for years, where Tom Brady would say, I'm gonna compensate my offensive lineman in some capacity with gifts or those kinds of things. And so I think there is a little bit of a myth of it's going to destroy everything. It all comes down to leadership, and y'all's leadership in the space and helping institutions navigate it. I think it's important. And then the institutions to be able to educate student athletes about, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. And I think that's critical.
And frankly, that your point about education, that's kind of one of the three pillars of any announcement we make with schools, is that you do provide that education for student athletes, because there are a lot of naysayers and there is a lot of confusion and noise in the ecosystem, and cutting through that clutter and educating student athletes will help them make better and informed decisions. And we know that. And so if we announce with a school, just know that they've allowed education to occur. And we think that's important. Frankly, we're happy to provide the education, but one of the reasons we work with Altius and Casey in the group is, if you want a third party to provide that education, we're okay with that occurring. In fact, we're more than okay with that occurring.
You probably endorse that occurring. I mean, it's not. I think you go even beyond we're okay with it. We endorse the fact that we got to make sure that student athletes don't make a mistake.
That's right.
And I'll remind people that social media is forever now. And so, do you want to make a post? It'll be interesting to see. I'm spending a lot of my time in the twilight of my career trying to do what I call harnessing the tribes to better society. And so, we've got a number of charities that we work with, but one of the things I'm going to really watch is we've got a generation of young people that are probably more politically active maybe since my generation was, in college. And are they going to endorse political candidates? Are they going to endorse certain legislative issues? And that's great, but you want to remind them what you did then may come back to haunt you 30 years from now. You know what I'm saying? I mean, yeah. I mean, and so I think we have to, a lot of times people watch these kids on TV. I was at the Kentucky Duke game the other night, and those are the two biggest teams I've ever seen. I mean, the physical attributes of the Duke basketball players and the Kentucky players just blew me away. They're still kids.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
They're still kids. I mean, my wife laughingly says and affectionately says every time she sees a bunch of student athletes having dinner, there's a lot of stupid in that room. And we laugh about it. But we owe them wisdom.
We do.
And
I totally agree.
yeah, and so that's what I love about your agency is collectively decades of wisdom in the ecosystem.
Yep.
And part of the wisdom is also working with the corporate partners that are going to use student athletes and make sure that they do it the right way too.
That is it exactly. And frankly, we try to get schools comfortable with the fact that we want to work with their corporate partners. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Could you go, I guess in theory, do some ambushing program? Yeah, but why? And why not help benefit the school and the student athlete at the same time? And so that's been our message so far.
Well, it's interesting. I've been a little bit of a I've swum against the current in the sponsorship industry forever, and I think it served me pretty well. I mean, like one of the things that I've always laughed about was why do 3-year agreements cost you more each year when you can buy 3 bars of soap and it's cheaper than 1 bar of soap times 3? Why? I mean, I've always, the escalation in contracts I've always laughed about and said that's illogical to me. But the other thing that I have always been kind of adamant against is what I call exclusivity. It allows, in my opinion, sponsors to be bad sponsors. They buy exclusive rights and then they don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
And so I'm not opposed to ambush, quite frankly. And if a student athlete can go out and take a rival brand and do something meaningful with it, shame on the other brand for not being strategic. I've worked with ESPN for so long, and Rob Temple, who's our CEO now, he has a great line. He would say, "At ESPN, we never sold exclusivity; we sold dominance and clarity." and,
Well said.
and that meant I could sell to Home Depot and Lowe's at the same time. I think that, and I think sometimes rights holders cave on exclusivity. They give that up too fast. And NIL's going to kind of prevent that. So I feel like there's some certain people in the ecosystem that fear that. Like, well, moment, I bought the exclusive rights to that. Well, you did for the marks, but you didn't necessarily, and for the institution, but you didn't necessarily for all the student athletes.
No, that's right. But I do think that they should be our first phone call because they have an investment with the university. And now that we are onboarding thousands of athletes, they should be our first call because they should be the one who wants to engage with student athletes and have them help them sell their message to alumni and fans of that university. And so that is what we're attempting to do. And and it's been some mixed messaging out in the marketplace, but I think over time the clutter will clear. And it's funny. So much of the university ecosystem, find this so complex. But really, again, we have to look at the professional models and we have to see, well, how has this worked in the NFL and how has this worked in the NBA? And they've been doing this for 30 and 35 years and they have stepped in every pothole. And so it's kind of neat to be able to point to that and say, yeah, that's why we have this plan in place. And that's why we have these rules in place. And so I think we can get everyone comfortable in this messy world that we're not reinventing the wheel. We are making it work for college, and it's going to be different than what happens in the NFL and the NBA, Major League Baseball. And it has to be because they're not employees and it's not a union and all of those things. And we can make this work. And so I think that they just like having an adult voice in the room.
Well, I do believe that there is that, tendency in America to look for the loser at the table. And, in this case, there's not a loser at the table. Everybody can win here with the appropriate, processes and systems and learnings and all that. And clearly y'all are adding schools every day and the proof is in the pudding. It's obviously working. You're convincing more and more schools, let us help you navigate a lot of complexity.
Yep.
And let us be someone that can help you do that in a way that I think is meaningful. I think would be totally foolish to say, oh, the NFL Players Association system is wrong. The NBA system is wrong. That's a little naive. You've got to do things a little bit differently, like you said, because there's certain, bargaining rights or collective rights that they legally don't have. They're not a union. They're not going to be, doing those kind of things. But the processes remain, I think, a lot of the same. What are you most excited about in NIL? What do you think's, what kind of gets you going in the morning?
It's really just kind of proving to the naysayers that it can happen, and it's actually developing these opportunities for student athletes. And I know it sounds, trivial, but, just issuing student athletes checks, that gets me going in the day, frankly. And, we've been talking about this, for 10 years. This has been the lead business story in sports for 10 years. And so it's just going every single day and talking to a new school or a new group of student athletes or a new licensee and opening the door for how this can work. And so I know it sounds cliche-ish, but it's really exciting. And it's an exciting time to be involved in college sports, and it's an exciting time to be doing the things that we're doing, because every day we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, and it's really cool.
Well, y'all are doing a great job. I think it's a good place to leave today. All I know is this: we haven't seen the last chapter written. I think there's some things that need to be done. I'm really watching the federal government. I mean, we cannot have 50 states have 50 different laws. I mean, we just simply can't have that, and we need an overriding legislation that allows, and in my opinion, it needs to allow the student athlete to use the institution mark and for them to be able to collectively do stuff, because that's just common sense.
I know.
And anytime we try to legislate against common sense, it has bad consequences. In fact, it always does. And in this case, I think y'all are bringing a lot of common sense to the ecosystem. We've been friends for a long time. I'm really proud of what you've done. I think y'all are a beacon for institutions right now and for their student athletes, and y'all are going to help them maximize the opportunities for them. And last time I checked, that's called the American dream. That's what we have done. Capitalism is the greatest liberator of any form of economic system. And anytime you try to restrict people, it has bad consequences. And we've done that for decades, and now we've finally realized we've been wrong. And I think it's a great time for a young person. I also think most people don't know how hard student athletes have to work.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they just don't. If you followed them around, you would go, when do they have free time?
I know.
And the answer is they don't.
To be a student athlete and to be a kid, it is. I agree with
right. You. And so, the ability now to generate some dollars and take advantage of their name, image, and likeness, I think is a big deal. And y'all are doing a great job with that. And Wesley, I can't thank you enough for kind of coming on with us today and helping educate everybody. And I appreciate you being with us today from the bridge.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you for the kind words. And it was great catching up with you, Rick. And we have been friends. I look at that picture from staying at Bill Battle's place with
the bear. With the bear.
Yeah. You, me, and Pat and I chuckle about it all the time, about how wrong and in some ways how right they were and some of the things we talked about that weekend. And so, anyway, Rick, it's good to be with you, and thank you for the invite.
That'd be great. Talk to you soon, Wesley. See you, buddy. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Here's a personal request from the old Soapbox. I travel a lot for both business and for fun, and I fly a lot, like a whole lot, like almost 4 million miles on Delta Airlines alone a lot. And the truth is, I'm not that fond of flying because I really hate turbulence. But what I really hate more is turbulence without a word from the pilot. I like pilots who talk to me and the other passengers. Just tell me the truth. Tell me we're going to have a rough air for so many minutes. Tell me how long it is going to last. Tell me you're looking for smoother air or there's no smoother air. But tell me something. I cannot stand a bumpy flight with silence from the cockpit. Mostly if you talk to me, then I'll know you're paying attention. And that's my view from the soapbox and from up in the air. Todd Blackledge is one of my favorite college football commentators, and I'm glad he's brought back his Taste of the Town feature, where he goes to a great local restaurant in the town where he's covering a game. Several years ago, he wrote a book also called Taste of the Town, and of course, I have a copy of it. In honor of Todd and the return of Taste of the Town, here's one of his and my favorite places in Knoxville, Tennessee. In Knoxville, there's this terrific burger joint called Litton's Market Restaurant and Bakery. It started out in the 80s as a meat market. They've got freshly ground beef with grilled onions, and they bake their buns daily on site. They also make terrific hand-cut fries and hand-battered onion rings. You wash it all down with wonderful sweet tea. And then you finish it all up with a slice of red velvet cake and a cup of coffee. It's great eating for Todd's Taste of the Town and for you and me. On the Road with Rick, Litton's Great Burgers, Knoxville, Tennessee. That's our show for today. I hope it made you think differently about NIL and what's ahead for college sports. Thanks to my friend Wesley Haynes for his insights, and to you for listening in. We hope to see you back here next week from the bridge.